People have a terrible habit. When they don't understand something big, they call it luck. They look at China's rise and say, well, they got lucky. Lucky timing, lucky globalization, lucky demographics. That's nonsense. There is no such thing as a lucky accident that lifts a country of over 1 billion people out of poverty in one generation. That kind of result does not come from luck. It comes from a system that works. And when the result is that large, you can be sure the mechanism underneath is doing most of the heavy lifting. Human beings prefer stories to mechanisms. Stories are comforting. Mechanisms require thinking, and thinking is hard. So people talk about ideology, geopolitics, morality, or fate. Almost nobody wants to sit down and ask the boring but essential question: what actually caused the result? If you want to understand success, whether in investing, business, or nations, you have to do the opposite. You ignore the noise. You ignore the moral speeches. You look for the incentives, the structure, and the behavior those incentives produced. That's how reality works. China did something that has no real precedent in history. Never before has a country that large advanced that fast. Not Rome, not Britain, not the United States, not Japan. The scale alone makes the outcome extraordinary. And extraordinary outcomes demand extraordinary explanations, not fairy tales. So let's clear the ground first. China did not rise because it discovered some magical ideology. It did not rise because it was morally superior, and it did not rise because the rich world generously carried it uphill. Those explanations are lazy. Worse, they are wrong. What actually happened was much simpler and much more uncomfortable for people who like neat narratives. China stopped caring about being right and started caring about what worked. That sounds trivial. It isn't. Most people in most nations never manage to do it. The default human condition is commitment to bad ideas long after the evidence is turned against them. We see it everywhere. Investors cling to losing stocks because they are emotionally attached. Corporations defend obsolete products because they once worked. Governments protect failed policies because admitting error looks weak. China, at a critical moment, did something rare. It changed course. There's a famous line attributed to Deng Xiaoping: "I don't care whether the cat is black or white. I care whether it catches mice." That sentence tells you more about China's rise than a library full of political theory. It was a declaration of intellectual humility, results over doctrine, outcomes over slogans. Once you adopt that mindset, a lot of things become possible that are otherwise forbidden by pride. People often underestimate how hard it is to abandon ideology. Ideology gives people identity. It gives them moral comfort. But ideology that doesn't produce food, jobs, and stability eventually collapses under its own weight. China learned that lesson the hard way and then, crucially, did not repeat the mistake. Another thing people get wrong is assuming that China invented everything it used. It didn't. Quite the opposite. China copied. And that's not an insult. That's a compliment. One of the great mistakes people make is believing that originality is more important than effectiveness. In the real world, copying something that works is often far more intelligent than inventing something new that doesn't. China looked around and asked a brutally practical question. Who has already solved this problem? Not who talks the best. Not who has the prettiest theories. Who has actually produced prosperity, order, and competence? The answer wasn't complicated. It was Singapore. Singapore was small. China was enormous. But the principles scaled. Singapore had clean governance, harsh penalties for corruption, an obsession with competence, and a willingness to be unpopular in the short term to achieve results in the long term. And Singapore had one more thing: leadership that cared about outcomes, not applause. China didn't copy Singapore because it admired it aesthetically. Copied Singapore because it worked. That's how rational systems behave. People in the West often struggle with this idea. They think copying implies inferiority. In reality, refusing to copy what works is a form of arrogance. It's saying your pride matters more than your results. In investing, the people who do best are not the ones with the most original ideas. They are the ones who consistently apply a few ideas that are known to work. Nations are not that different. Another uncomfortable truth: China's rise was not financed by the generosity of rich countries. It was financed largely by the discipline of its own people, many of whom were very poor. The savings rate in China was extraordinary. People saved not because they were rich, but because they had to be. That pool of savings became capital. Capital became factories. Factories became exports. Exports became growth. No romance, no miracles, just arithmetic. Most societies want consumption now and sacrifice later. China flipped the equation. It chose sacrifice first, consumption later. That decision is politically painful. It requires patience, social discipline, and a tolerance for delayed gratification that most populations simply don't have. But the math works every time. So when people ask, what is the secret of China's success? The honest answer disappoints them. There is no secret. There is only a sequence of rational decisions made consistently at enormous scale over a long period of time. People who prefer moral posturing to numerical reality will never like that answer. But reality does not care about opinions. It only responds to behavior. If you want to understand China, stop asking whether you approve of it. That's irrelevant. Start asking what incentives were created, what behaviors followed, and what results those behaviors produced. That's how you understand anything that actually works. And once you do that, the so-called miracle starts to look very ordinary, just applied with uncommon discipline. Most people think ideology is a strength. It isn't. Ideology is a shortcut that saves you from thinking. And shortcuts are dangerous when reality refuses to cooperate. For a long time, China was trapped by ideology. It had theories. It had slogans. It had certainty. What it didn't have was prosperity. And eventually, even the most committed ideologue has to answer a simple question. Why are my people still poor? That's where the black cat and white cat come in. I don't care if the cat is black or white. I care whether it catches mice. That sentence sounds folksy. It isn't. It's ruthless. It announces the death of theory as the primary decision-maker. It says results are the judge, jury, and executioner. In my experience, that attitude alone explains an enormous amount of success in life. The world does not reward good intentions. It rewards effectiveness. China reached a point where continuing to defend failed ideas was more dangerous than admitting they were wrong. That moment is rare. Most systems never get there. They collapse first. Look at history. When ideology fails, leaders usually double down. They blame enemies. They blame saboteurs. They blame insufficient faith. Anything but the idea itself. That's how you turn a bad system into a catastrophe. China instead did something unusual. It changed the question. Instead of asking, is this ideologically pure? It asked, does this raise living standards? That single shift reorganized everything. Suddenly, private incentives were allowed to exist. Markets were tolerated. Profit stopped being treated as a moral crime. Foreign capital became a tool, not a threat. None of this happened because someone fell in love with capitalism. It happened because poverty is persuasive. People underestimate how difficult it is to run a country of that size without pragmatism. Abstract ideas collapse under scale. Only systems that work in practice survive when you multiply them by 1 billion people. China didn't abandon control. That's a common misunderstanding. It abandoned rigidity. There's a difference. Control can coexist with experimentation. Rigidity cannot. What China did was allow local trials. If something worked in one region, it spread. If it failed, it was quietly buried. No grand apologies, no philosophical debates, just adaptation. That's how evolution works. And evolution, unlike ideology, doesn't care about consistency. One reason this offends intellectuals is that it looks unprincipled. But life is not a philosophy seminar. It's a series of trade-offs under constraints. The people who win are the ones who learn fastest. Another important point: pragmatism does not mean softness. In fact, it often requires the opposite. Once China decided outcomes mattered more than purity, it became willing to do unpleasant things in the short term to achieve long-term goals. Delayed gratification at national scale is rare. Democracies struggle with it. Corporations struggle with it. Individuals struggle with it. But the arithmetic doesn't change just because the decision is unpopular. China accepted inequality early as the price of growth. That made many people uncomfortable. But they understood something fundamental. You can't distribute wealth you haven't created. First you grow the pie, then you argue about slices. That sequencing matters. Get it wrong and you end up with slogans instead of factories. This is where the black cat metaphor really bites. If a method produces growth, employment, and rising productivity, it catches mice. If it produces speeches and shortages, it doesn't. Everything else is decoration. Western observers often miss this because they focus on labels. They want to know whether China is capitalist or socialist. That's the wrong question. China is opportunistic. It borrows whatever tool solves the immediate problem. That makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't fit clean categories. But clean categories are for textbooks, not survival. In investing, I've seen the same mistake for decades. People fall in love with a style, growth, value, momentum, and then defend it regardless of results. Sensible investors don't do that. They ask, is this still working? And if not, why? China applied that logic at scale. It didn't ask permission from philosophers. It didn't wait for moral consensus. It ran experiments, kept what worked. It discarded what didn't. And here's the part people really don't like. This approach requires leaders who are comfortable being criticized. Pragmatism guarantees you will offend purists. You will be accused of betrayal, hypocrisy, moral compromise. That's the price of effectiveness. Lee Kuan Yew understood this perfectly, and China noticed. Singapore didn't succeed because it was ideologically elegant. It succeeded because it was relentlessly practical. China absorbed that lesson and applied it with Chinese characteristics, meaning scale, patience, and control. Once ideology stops blocking feedback, learning accelerates. And when learning accelerates in a system that large, the results compound very quickly. That's what most people mistake for luck. It isn't luck. It's feedback loops functioning without interference from dogma. The black cat doesn't care what you believe. It either catches mice or it doesn't. And once you accept that rule, reality becomes a very efficient teacher, even if the lessons are uncomfortable. That is how China moved from theory to traction. There's an odd superstition in the modern world that copying is somehow shameful. People think success must be original to be legitimate. That's a childish idea, and it causes enormous damage. In reality, almost all progress is borrowed. If you look at how knowledge actually spreads, it's imitation first, refinement second, and innovation last. Skipping the first step is how you waste decades. China didn't waste time trying to invent a perfect system from scratch. It did something far more intelligent. It looked for a working model and studied it closely. That model was Singapore. Now, on the surface, this looks ridiculous. Singapore is a tiny city-state. China is a continental civilization. But that objection misses the point. Principles scale even when geography doesn't. Singapore had already solved a problem China desperately needed to solve. How to create order, competence, and prosperity without chaos. It had no natural resources, no large domestic market, no margin for error. Failure meant extinction. And yet it worked. Why? Because Singapore was run like an engineering project, not a political performance. Lee Kuan Yew understood something most leaders never grasp. Good governance is mostly about incentives and enforcement, not speeches. You reward competence. You punish corruption. You remove excuses. And you do it consistently, even when it makes you unpopular. China noticed this. What amused me, frankly, is that China found its best model of Chinese leadership outside of China. Lee Kuan Yew was Chinese by heritage but not trapped by traditional Chinese bureaucratic habits. He kept what worked culturally and discarded what didn't. That combination is rare. China didn't copy Singapore's size. It copied its logic. First, law and order are non-negotiable. Economic growth collapses when people don't trust contracts, property, or basic safety. Singapore enforced rules brutally and fairly. China followed suit. Second, corruption is treated as a cancer, not a nuisance. Singapore didn't tolerate it. China, at least in key phases, understood that corruption at scale would destroy legitimacy and growth. You can debate execution, but the intent was clear. Third, competence beats popularity. Singapore paid civil servants well and demanded performance. China created pathways where capable administrators could rise, often through results rather than rhetoric. This offends people who prefer democratic theater. But efficiency doesn't require applause. It requires systems that select for ability instead of charm. Another lesson China absorbed was long-term thinking. Lee Kuan Yew was obsessed with what Singapore would look like in 30 or 50 years. Not the next election, not the next headline. China adopted the same horizon. When you plan that far ahead, you can justify short-term pain for long-term gain. You can build infrastructure that won't pay off for decades. You can educate at scale without immediate returns. Most governments can't do this because they are trapped in short feedback cycles. Copying that mindset alone was a massive advantage. People often ask why China didn't simply follow the Western model wholesale. The answer is simple. The Western model evolved under very different conditions. It wasn't designed for 1 billion people climbing out of poverty simultaneously. China needed speed, coordination, and tolerance for imperfection. Singapore had already demonstrated that tight control combined with economic openness could work. So China adapted it, and adaptation is key. Copying doesn't mean carbon copying. It means understanding the core mechanism and adjusting the rest. This is exactly how good investors operate. You don't copy the surface details of someone else's success. You copy the underlying logic. The rest is context. China copied Singapore's respect for results. It copied its obsession with competence. It copied its willingness to be disliked. Then it layered those principles onto its own scale and history. That's why it worked. The real lesson here is uncomfortable for people who like originality. Progress belongs to those who are humble enough to learn from others and disciplined enough to apply the lessons consistently. Most nations fail not because they lack ideas, but because they lack the character to copy what already works. China, for a crucial period, had that character. And once you remove pride from the equation, growth becomes much easier. Singapore showed the blueprint. China scaled it. That's not magic. That's rational behavior. Most explanations of China's rise politely skip the part that makes everyone uncomfortable. That's a mistake, because this part explains more than all the speeches combined. China did not get rich by redistributing wealth from a rich population. It got rich by extracting savings from a poor one. That statement sounds harsh because it is harsh. But reality is not designed to make us feel virtuous. It's designed to produce outcomes. When China began its modern rise, it did not have abundant capital. Capital is the fuel of growth, and China didn't have it. So it had to be created, and it was created the only way it ever is, by saving more than you consume. The remarkable thing is who did the saving. It wasn't a class of wealthy elites. It was hundreds of millions of ordinary people, many of them barely above subsistence, who saved an extraordinary portion of their income. In some periods, national savings rates approached 50%. That is almost unimaginable in the West. In wealthy countries, people save because they can afford to. In China, people save because they had to. There was no safety net to fall back on. No illusion that someone else would pick up the bill. When the system tells you survival depends on restraint, behavior adjusts very quickly. Those savings didn't sit idle. They were channeled, sometimes clumsily, sometimes ruthlessly, into investment. Roads, ports, factories, power plants, housing, manufacturing capacity at a scale the world had never seen. That's the mechanism. Savings become capital. Capital becomes production. Production becomes growth. There is no alternative sequence. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling fantasy. Western critics often argue that China's growth depended on exploiting foreign capital. That's a comforting story because it preserves moral superiority. It's also mostly wrong. Foreign investment helped at the margin, but it was never the primary driver. The real engine was domestic savings recycled into domestic investment. That required discipline. It required delayed gratification, and it required a population willing to accept lower consumption today for a better future tomorrow. Most societies can't pull that off. People want comfort now and progress later, if it arrives at all. China reversed the order. The state played a central role in enforcing this outcome. Interest rates were kept low. Consumption was restrained. Investment was favored. From a moral standpoint, you can argue about fairness. From an economic standpoint, the result was predictable. Capital accumulation at that speed changes everything. Factories appear where farms once stood. Infrastructure shrinks distance. Productivity compounds. Once that flywheel starts turning, it feeds on itself. This is where people confuse sacrifice with oppression. They aren't the same thing. Sacrifice is choosing to give up something now to gain something larger later. Oppression is being forced to give up something without a future payoff. China's leadership for a long time made a bet. Endure pain now, grow fast, and then distribute later. That bet worked economically, whether one approves of the method or not. In investing, the same principle applies. If you consume all your returns early, compounding never gets a chance. You feel good today and poor forever. If you reinvest relentlessly, discomfort becomes a temporary condition and wealth becomes a permanent one. China reinvested relentlessly. Another inconvenient detail. Saving at that level requires cultural reinforcement. Frugality was not discouraged. It was praised. Speculation was constrained. Excess was viewed with suspicion. These attitudes don't arise by accident. They are cultivated. People in consumer societies underestimate how powerful that cultural signal is. When restraint is normal, behavior aligns. When indulgence is normal, debt replaces savings and stagnation replaces growth. The math doesn't care which culture you prefer. Once China had built sufficient capital stock, the story changed. Consumption rose. Living standards improved. But none of that could have happened without the prior period of austerity. That sequence is what people find hard to accept. They want prosperity without patience, wealth without waiting, growth without sacrifice. History offers no examples where that works. China's rise was not financed by generosity from abroad or miracles at home. It was financed by millions of small decisions to spend less than was earned, repeated day after day, year after year, at unimaginable scale. That's not a story people like to tell, but it's the one that explains the outcome. People love to argue about systems in the abstract. Capitalism versus socialism. Democracy versus central control. Those debates are mostly academic. What actually matters is whether a system fits the scale and stage of development it's applied to. Scale is not a footnote. Scale is the whole story. China wasn't trying to fine-tune a mature economy. It was trying to industrialize a civilization. That changes the problem entirely.